They thought they could break me at my own engagement party. Standing there in their finest clothes, surrounded by champagne glasses and fake smiles, my parents leaned in close like conspirators sharing a dirty secret. Their voices were low, venomous whispers that cut through the celebration like shattered glass. "You're a disgrace to this family." The words hit me like a physical blow. Here I was, surrounded by 200 guests who had come to celebrate what should have been the happiest moment of my life, and my own blood was driving a knife between my ribs. The man I thought I'd marry stood just 20 feet away, laughing with his groomsmen, completely oblivious to the assassination happening right behind him. My mother's perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around my wrist like a vice. "Look at yourself," she hissed, her lipstick a slash of red fury across her face. "Look at the mess you've made of everything we built." My father nodded, his cold eyes scanning the room as if he was already calculating the damage to his precious reputation. 28 years we've invested in you," he said, his voice dripping with disgust. 28 years of opportunities, education, connections. And this is how you repay us? By embarrassing us in front of everyone who matters. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were the ones creating a scene, their harsh whispers drawing curious glances from nearby guests. But somehow, in their twisted logic, I was the embarrassment. I was the problem. I was the disgrace. My name is Sophia Chen, and that night, my parents didn't just humiliate me, they severed every bond that had ever connected us. They took 28 years of what I thought was love and revealed it for what it really was, a business investment that had failed to meet their expectations. The betrayal wasn't just in their words. It was in the way they delivered them, publicly, viciously, with the calculated precision of executioners. They wanted to hurt me, and they wanted witnesses. They wanted everyone in that room to see me brought low, to watch the golden daughter crumble under the weight of their disappointment. But here's what they didn't know as they twisted their verbal knife. That moment of humiliation would become the foundation of their own destruction. Every cruel word they spoke would eventually echo back to them tenfold. Every ounce of shame they heaped on me would become fuel for a fire they never saw coming. Drop your country and the time you're watching this in the comments below. Because no matter where you are in the world, no matter what time it is, betrayal feels the same. It burns the same. And revenge? Revenge tastes just as sweet everywhere. I left that party like a ghost fleeing a graveyard. The elevator ride down from the hotel's ballroom felt like descending into hell, each floor marked by the echo of my parents' words bouncing around my skull. The golden dress I'd chosen so carefully now felt like a costume I couldn't wait to tear off, a reminder of how foolish I'd been to believe this night would be different. The hotel lobby was a blur of marble and crystal, beautiful people living beautiful lives that suddenly felt as foreign to me as another planet. I stumbled through those glass doors into the night air, gasping like I'd been drowning, and finally broke the surface. But there was no relief waiting for me out there, just the cold reality of what had just happened. My phone buzzed with messages. Friends from the party, confused about where I'd gone. My fiancé, demanding explanations. But reading them felt like looking at communications from another life, one I could never go back to. How do you explain to someone that your parents just executed you in public? How do you tell the man you're supposed to marry that your own family thinks you're worthless? I found myself walking the streets for hours, my heels clicking against concrete like a countdown to nowhere. The city moved around me, late-night revelers, couples holding hands, people living normal lives where parents loved their children and families celebrated together. I felt like an alien observing a species I'd never understand again. By 3 a.m, I was holed up in a hotel room across town, staring at the ceiling and listening to my phone buzz with increasingly frantic messages. The gossip network had already kicked into high gear. I could imagine the conversations happening in living rooms and coffee shops across the city. Did you see what happened at the Chen engagement? She just disappeared. Her parents looked mortified. There's definitely more to the story. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, my mother's twisted smile of satisfaction, my father's cold dismissal. The way they'd looked at me like I was something they'd scraped off their shoe. 28 years of being their daughter, and in 30 seconds, they'd made it clear I was nothing more than a failed experiment. The worst part wasn't even their cruelty. It was the realization that this hadn't come out of nowhere. This had been building for years, maybe decades. Every criticism disguised as concern, every backhanded compliment, every time they'd made me feel like I wasn't quite good enough, it had all been leading to this moment. They'd been preparing to discard me long before I gave them an excuse. My friends started calling the next morning. Their voices were careful, walking on eggshells around the obvious question, what the hell happened? But even their sympathy felt like pity, and pity was just another form of humiliation. They'd all witnessed my parents' assassination of my character, and now they were treating me like a wounded animal that needed to be handled with care. The neighbors in my apartment building gave me those looks when I finally went home. The sideways glances that said they'd heard something, knew something, were talking about something when I wasn't around. It's amazing how quickly you can go from being a person to being a story people tell at dinner parties. If you've ever been treated like an outcast by the people who were supposed to love you most, hit that subscribe button. Because you know this feeling, the way betrayal doesn't just hurt, it rewrites your entire understanding of reality. It makes you question every memory, every moment of supposed love, every time you thought you mattered to someone. My fiancé lasted exactly 3 days before he ended our engagement. He couldn't handle the family drama, he said, as if my parents' cruelty was somehow contagious. As if associating with me might damage his own reputation. Turned out he was just as shallow as they were, just as concerned with appearances as substance. But losing him didn't feel like another blow, it felt like clarity. Everyone was showing me exactly who they really were when the spotlight got too hot. The friends who stopped calling, the relatives who suddenly became unavailable, the social circles that quietly froze me out. They were all teaching me the same lesson my parents had started, that I was completely, utterly alone. And maybe that was exactly where I needed to be. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 2 weeks after my world imploded. I was sitting in my apartment, surrounded by sympathy flowers that were starting to rot, when an unknown number lit up my screen. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail like I had with every other call lately. But something made me answer. Miss Chin? This is Marcus Whitfield from Whitfield and Associates. I'm calling regarding your grandmother's estate. My grandmother. I hadn't thought about her in months, maybe longer. She died when I was 25, a quiet woman who'd always lived in the shadow of my parents' louder, more demanding presence. At her funeral, I remembered feeling sad but distant, like I was mourning someone I'd never really known. I apologize for the delay in contacting you, the lawyer continued, his voice professional but warm. There were some complications with the probate process, but everything has been resolved. I need to discuss your inheritance with you. Inheritance. The word felt foreign. My grandmother had lived modestly as far as I knew. A small apartment, simple clothes, a quiet life. What could she possibly have left me that would require a lawyer's attention? I'm afraid I don't understand, I said, my voice hoarse from crying and disuse. My parents handled all the estate matters when she passed. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that suggested I'd just said something very interesting. Miss Chin, I think there might be some confusion here. Your parents weren't the executors of your grandmother's will. You were. And there are some significant assets that require your immediate attention. The room started spinning. My parents had told me there was nothing left, that my grandmother's modest savings had barely covered her funeral expenses. They'd handled everything while I was grieving, taking care of the family business, like they always did. Except apparently, they'd lied. What kind of assets? I asked, my heart starting to pound. I'd prefer to discuss this in person, Whitfield said. Can you come to my office this afternoon? There are documents you need to see, and decisions that only you can make. 3 hours later, I was sitting across from a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a movie about expensive lawyers. His office was all dark wood and leather, the kind of place where serious money was discussed in hushed tones. But it was the stack of papers in front of him that made my hands shake. "Your grandmother was a very private woman," he began, opening a thick folder. "She owned 3 properties in the city, including the building where your parents' business is located. She also had substantial investments, all of which she left to you with very specific instructions." I stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language. "That's impossible. My grandmother lived in a 1-bedroom apartment. She coupon clipped. She was also one of the smartest investors I've ever worked with," Whitfield interrupted gently. "She started buying property in the city when it was still affordable, back in the 1960s. She lived modestly because she was building something for you." The papers he showed me made no sense at first. Property deeds, investment portfolios, bank statements showing numbers that seemed to have too many zeros. But slowly, the picture became clear. My quiet, unassuming grandmother had been worth millions. And she'd left every penny of it to me. Why didn't my parents tell me about this? I asked, though even as the words left my mouth, I was starting to understand. Whitfield's expression darkened. "Because they've been managing these assets for the past 3 years, thinking they would eventually inherit them when they assumed you wouldn't be capable of handling them yourself." The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Not only had my parents stolen my inheritance, they'd been planning for my failure all along. They'd been counting on me never amounting to anything, never being worthy of my grandmother's legacy. They'd seen my grandmother's death as their opportunity to claim what they thought should have been theirs. "There's more," Whitfield continued, his voice careful. "Your parents have been using the rental income from these properties to fund their lifestyle for the past 3 years. The lease on their business location, the expensive cars, the country club membership, it's all been paid for with money that legally belongs to you." I felt like I was drowning and breathing for the first time simultaneously. Every luxury my parents had flaunted, every time they'd made me feel like I wasn't contributing enough to the family, every guilt trip about money, it had all been funded by my inheritance. They'd been living off my grandmother's legacy while treating me like a burden. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Now, Miss Chin, you have some very interesting decisions to make," Whitfield said, leaning back in his chair. "Your parents' business lease expires at the end of this month. Their loan payments on those cars are 3 months behind. And legally, they owe you approximately $200,000 in back rent and income." The power dynamic that had governed my entire life had just flipped completely upside down. The parents who had called me a disgrace, who had humiliated me in front of 200 people, who had treated me like a failed investment, they needed me now. They needed my signature, my permission, my mercy. And I had absolutely no intention of giving them any of it. The first call came 6 hours after I left Whitfield's office. My mother's name lit up my phone screen like a warning beacon, but I let it ring through to voicemail. Then my father called. Then my mother again. Then both of them in rapid succession, their desperation bleeding through the digital silence. I listened to the voicemails with the detached fascination of a scientist observing lab rats. My mother's voice, usually so controlled and cutting, had taken on a frantic edge. "Sophia, honey, we need to talk about your grandmother's estate. There are some complications that require your immediate attention." Honey. She hadn't called me honey since I was 12 years old. My father's messages were more direct, more demanding. "Sophia, this is important. Call me back immediately. There are legal matters that can't wait." Even in his panic, he couldn't bring himself to ask. He could only command. But I didn't call back. Instead, I sat in my apartment, staring at my phone as it lit up over and over again with their increasingly frantic attempts to reach me. Each ignored call felt like a small victory, a tiny rebellion against 28 years of jumping whenever they snapped their fingers. The text messages started around midnight. Long paragraphs about family responsibility and urgent business matters. Accusations that I was being childish and irresponsible. threats about legal consequences if I didn't respond. And finally, around 3 in the morning, something I'd never seen from either of them, an apology. Sophia, I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, but we're family. Whatever happened at the engagement party, we can work through it. Please call me Mom. I read it 3 times, looking for the catch, the manipulation, the hidden barb. But it seemed genuine, or at least desperate enough to pass for genuine. They were scared. Actually, truly scared. And it felt absolutely magnificent. Whitfield called me the next morning with updates. Your parents visited my office yesterday afternoon, he said, and I could hear the amusement in his voice. They seemed very concerned about ensuring you understood your responsibilities regarding the estate. What did you tell them? That all decisions regarding the estate were entirely up to you, and that they had no legal standing to make demands or threats. He paused. They didn't take that information well. I could imagine. My parents, who had controlled every aspect of my life for 28 years, suddenly finding themselves powerless. My father, who had built his entire identity around being the man in charge, being told by a lawyer that his own daughter held all the cards. They're going to keep calling, Whitfield warned me. The pressure will get intense. Are you prepared for that? I've been preparing for this my whole life, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. I just didn't know it. The calls continued for 3 days straight. Sometimes they came every few minutes, sometimes there would be hours of silence before the assault resumed. My parents tag-teamed me like experienced interrogators, alternating between my mother's emotional manipulation and my father's authoritarian demands. My phone became a weapon they were using against me, so I turned it off. I bought a new phone with a new number and gave it only to Whitfield. The silence that followed was the most peaceful I'd felt in years. But peace wasn't what I was after. I wanted them to feel exactly what they'd put me through, the helplessness, the desperation, the crushing realization that the people you'd counted on had abandoned you. I wanted them to understand what it felt like to need someone who wouldn't respond. Whitfield became my ally in this silent war. He'd call with updates about my parents' increasingly frantic visits to his office, their attempts to find legal loopholes, their growing panic as deadlines approached. Your father tried to argue that you're mentally unfit to handle the estate, he told me during one of our calls. I informed him that would require a formal psychological evaluation, court hearings, and substantial legal fees. He seemed less enthusiastic about that option. And my mother? She asked if there was any way to contest the will. I explained that your grandmother was very thorough in her documentation, and that any attempt to challenge her wishes would likely result in even more legal complications for them. Each day that passed without my response was another twist of the knife. Their business lease was expiring, their loan payments were overdue, and the financial house of cards they'd built with my money was starting to collapse. The same people who had called me a disgrace were now discovering what disgrace actually looked like. Silence is the loudest weapon, Whitfield told me during one of our conversations. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is absolutely nothing. He was right. My silence was destroying them more effectively than any confrontation could have. Every ignored call, every unanswered message, every day that passed without my signature on their documents was another brick removed from the foundation of their arrogance. Would you answer their calls? Would you give them the satisfaction of knowing they could still reach you, still manipulate you, still make you dance to their tune? Or would you do what I did, let them drown in the silence they'd created when they decided I was worthless? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you've ever wanted to watch someone's cruelty come back to destroy them, hit that subscribe button. Because this is just the beginning of their downfall. The beautiful thing about silence is that it forces people to face the consequences of their actions without any distractions. There's no argument to win, no explanation to demand, no way to manipulate the situation back in their favor. There's just the crushing weight of their own choices, pressing down on them day after day until they can barely breathe. My parents were about to learn that lesson in the most expensive way possible. The invitation arrived on a Thursday, hand-delivered to my apartment by a courier service that probably cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month. Cream-colored paper, embossed lettering, my mother's perfect handwriting flowing across the surface like calligraphy. Dearest Sophia, we cordially invite you to join us for dinner this Sunday evening at 7 o'clock. We have much to discuss as a family, and we miss you terribly. With all our love, Mother and Father. I read it 3 times, marveling at the performance. Dearest Sophia, with all our love. 2 weeks ago, these same people had called me a disgrace in front of 200 witnesses. Now they were sending me handwritten invitations like I was visiting royalty. The desperation was palpable. This wasn't just an invitation, it was a white flag, a surrender disguised as politeness. They needed me in that house, needed me to sign papers, needed me to save them from the financial catastrophe they'd created with their own greed and arrogance. I called Whitfield to let him know about the dinner invitation. They're getting desperate, he confirmed. Their business lease expires this week, and they've received foreclosure notices on both the cars and the house. Everything they own is leveraged against assets that legally belong to you. How long can they hold out? Maybe another week, possibly 2 if they liquidate everything else they have. But Miss Chin, there's something else you should know. Your father made some very specific threats yesterday about what would happen if you don't cooperate. The threats didn't scare me. If anything, they proved how completely powerless they'd become. Threatening someone is what you do when you have no actual power left, when you're backed into a corner and fighting with nothing but desperation and fury. I spent 3 days preparing for that dinner. Not preparing what to say, I'd been preparing for this conversation my entire life without knowing it. No, I was preparing who to be. The broken girl who'd fled that engagement party was gone. In her place was someone harder, colder, more focused. Someone who had learned that sometimes love was just control wearing a prettier mask. I chose my outfit carefully. A black dress that was elegant but severe, pearls that my grandmother had given me years ago, shoes that clicked against floors like punctuation marks. I wanted to look like success, like power, like everything they'd tried to convince me I could never be. Their house looked exactly the same as it always had, perfect landscaping, perfect paint, perfect windows that revealed nothing of the chaos happening inside. But knowing what I knew now, it all looked different. This wasn't a home, it was a monument to my stolen inheritance. Every expensive fixture, every piece of designer furniture, every carefully curated detail had been paid for with money that should have been mine. My mother answered the door wearing her most expensive dress and her most desperate smile. Sophia. Oh, sweetheart, you look wonderful. Come in, come in. She reached for me like she was going to embrace me, but I stepped back just enough to make it awkward. Her hands hung in the air for a moment before she pulled them back, her smile faltering. The dining room was set like a scene from a magazine, crystal glasses, silver cutlery, flowers that probably cost more than most people's weekly salary. They'd pulled out all the stops, created the perfect stage for what they hoped would be my surrender. My father stood when I entered, his posture stiff and formal. Sophia. He nodded like we were business associates meeting to discuss a contract. Which, I supposed, we were. I took my seat at the table where I'd eaten thousands of meals as a child, where they'd lectured me about grades and behavior and the importance of maintaining the family reputation. But this time, I wasn't their daughter seeking approval. I was their landlord, their creditor, their judge and jury all rolled into one. The first 15 minutes were excruciating theater. They asked about my health, my job, my life, as if they genuinely cared. They talked about the weather, current events, anything except the reason we were all sitting there. They served expensive wine and perfectly prepared food while dancing around the elephant in the room with the grace of amateur performers. But I could see the cracks in their performance. My mother's hands shook slightly when she poured the wine. My father kept checking his watch like he was calculating something urgent. The The conversation felt forced, artificial, like actors who'd forgotten their lines and were improvising badly. Finally, when we reached dessert, my father cleared his throat and the real show began. "Sophia," he said, his voice taking on that familiar tone of paternal authority, "we need to discuss your grandmother's estate." There it was. The reason for the invitation, the expensive dinner, the elaborate performance of family warmth. They'd buttered me up, filled me with wine and good food, created the perfect atmosphere for manipulation. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They still thought I was the same person who'd fled their humiliation 2 weeks ago. I set down my fork and looked at him with the kind of calm that comes from holding all the cards. "What about it?" My mother leaned forward, her face arranged in an expression of concerned confusion. "Well, honey, there seem to be some complications with the legal documents. Some papers that need to be signed, some decisions that need to be made together as a family." "Together as a family," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. "That's interesting phrasing, considering you disowned me in front of 200 people 2 weeks ago." The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. My father's jaw tightened, and my mother's carefully applied smile finally cracked. "Now, Sophia," my father began, his voice taking on that familiar edge of irritation, "what happened at your engagement party was unfortunate, but—" "Unfortunate," I interrupted, my voice as sharp as broken glass. "You called me a disgrace. You humiliated me in public. You made it clear that I was worthless to you." I leaned back in my chair, enjoying the way they both flinched. "But now you need something from me, so suddenly I'm family again?" The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, my mother tried a different approach. "Sophia, we were under a lot of stress that night. Planning a wedding, dealing with all the pressure, trying to make everything perfect. We said things we didn't mean." "No," I said, my voice steady and cold. "You said exactly what you meant. You've always thought I was a disappointment. You've spent my entire life making that clear. The only difference is that night, you finally said it out loud." My father's composure was cracking. "Look, Sophia, I don't know what's gotten into you, but this attitude isn't helping anyone. We have serious business to discuss." "Serious business," I echoed. "Like how you've been stealing from me for 3 years. Like how you've been living off my inheritance while treating me like garbage. Like how every luxury you've enjoyed, every expensive dinner, every designer outfit has been paid for with money my grandmother left to me." The color drained from both their faces. They knew that I knew, but hearing it said out loud was like watching their last hope die in real time. "That's not, we were managing those assets responsibly," my mother stammered. "We were protecting your interests until you were mature enough to." "Mature enough?" I laughed, and the sound was like glass breaking. "I'm 28 years old. I have a master's degree, a successful career, and apparently enough business sense to see through your lies. How exactly am I not mature enough to handle my own money?" My father stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Enough. This conversation is getting out of hand. Sophia, you need to understand the reality of the situation. There are legal obligations, contractual commitments, financial responsibilities that can't be ignored." "You're absolutely right," I said, standing up to meet his stare. "There are financial responsibilities. Like the $200,000 in back rent you owe me. Like the fraudulent use of my assets to secure loans you can't repay. Like the breach of fiduciary duty that could land you both in prison." The word prison hit them like a physical blow. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her throat. My father's face went white, then red, then white again. "You wouldn't," my mother whispered. "Wouldn't I?" I asked, tilting my head like I was considering the possibility. "You taught me that family loyalty only goes one way. You taught me that love is conditional. You taught me that when someone shows you who they really are, you should believe them." I picked up my purse and headed for the door. "Congratulations. I finally learned your lessons." "Sophia, wait," my father called, his voice cracking with panic. "We can work this out. We can come to an arrangement that benefits everyone." I turned back to look at them one last time. My parents, who had seemed so powerful, so untouchable, so absolutely certain of their superiority, now looked like what they really were: scared, desperate people who had finally run out of options. "You're right about one thing," I said. "We can work this out. But not tonight. Tonight, I want you to think about what you've done. I want you to remember every cruel word, every humiliation, every time you made me feel worthless. And I want you to understand that the person you created with your cruelty is the same person who now holds your entire future in her hands." I walked out of that house the same way I'd walked out of the engagement party, alone, angry, and hurt. But this time, I wasn't fleeing in shame. This time, I was walking away with purpose, with power, with the absolute certainty that justice was finally within reach. The real destruction was about to begin. Did you want to cheer when I finally confronted them? Could you feel their desperation, their panic, their dawning realization that they destroyed the wrong person? Drop a comment and tell me if you would have walked away or stayed to twist the knife deeper. And if you want to see how this revenge story ends, you better hit that subscribe button. Because what comes next is going to make this dinner look like a friendly family reunion. The collapse happened faster than even I had anticipated. 3 days after our dinner, Whitfield called with the first update. "Your parents' business has been evicted," he reported with barely concealed satisfaction. "They couldn't make the emergency rent payment, and the new lease terms you approved were apparently unacceptable to them." Of course they were unacceptable. I'd tripled the rent, required personal guarantees from both parents, and included clauses that would allow me to terminate the lease immediately if they so much as looked at me wrong. They'd spent 3 years living rent-free off my inheritance. It was time they learned what market rates actually looked like. "What about their other assets?" I asked. "The cars were repossessed yesterday morning. Apparently, your father tried to argue with the repo men in front of the country club." Whitfield's amusement was audible. It caused quite a scene. Several of their friends witnessed the whole thing. The mental image was delicious. My father, who had spent decades building his reputation as a successful businessman, arguing with repo men in front of people whose respect he'd spent years cultivating. The humiliation must have been exquisite. But that was just the beginning. The real devastation came when the gossip network that had been so eager to spread news about my engagement party disaster turned its attention to my parents' financial collapse. In a community where appearances were everything, public failure was social death. My former fiancé's mother called me a week later, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Sophia, darling, I just wanted to check on you. I heard about your parents' unfortunate situation." The way she said "unfortunate" made it clear she was savoring every syllable. "I do hope they're managing to cope." She wasn't calling out of concern. She was calling to gloat, to revel in the fall of people who had once looked down on her family. The same social circles that had witnessed my humiliation were now watching my parents' destruction with the same hungry fascination. The engagement party that was supposed to announce my union became the event everyone remembered as the night the Chin family began to crumble. People talked about my sudden disappearance, my parents' obvious distress, the way the whole evening had an undercurrent of family drama that no one could quite explain. Now, with their financial collapse playing out publicly, the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. My mother's charity board positions evaporated one by one. Budget constraints, they claimed, but everyone knew the real reason. You can't have someone represent your organization when their own life is falling apart in spectacular fashion. Her Tuesday tennis games became solo affairs when her friends stopped returning her calls. The lunch invitations dried up. The social calendar that had been her lifeline became a wasteland of cancellations and polite rejections. My father's business relationships crumbled even faster. Word spread quickly through professional networks about the eviction, the repossessions, the financial irregularities. Clients started asking uncomfortable questions about the firm's stability. Partners began distancing themselves from the toxic association. Within 2 weeks, the company that had been their pride and joy was hemorrhaging clients and bleeding money. But the most brutal blow came from within the family itself. My mother's sister, Aunt Jennifer, who had always been jealous of my parents' apparent success, suddenly became very interested in asking pointed questions about financial responsibility and family values. The cousins who had looked up to my parents started avoiding family gatherings. The younger generation that had been groomed to see my parents as the family's success story began whispering about fraud and mismanagement. Family dinner conversations that once revolved around my parents' achievements now centered on damage control and reputation management. The relatives who had nodded approvingly when my parents criticized me were now doing the same thing to them. The family hierarchy that had placed my parents at the top was rapidly reorganizing itself around their absence. My cousin David called me 3 weeks into their downfall. "Sophia, I don't know what happened between you and your parents, but I wanted you to know that not everyone in the family agrees with how they've been acting." His voice was careful, diplomatic. "Some of us have been asking questions about your grandmother's estate, and the answers we're getting don't add up." The family was turning on them. The same relatives who had watched my public humiliation without intervention were now conducting their own investigation into my parents' financial ethics. They were discovering what I had learned, that the lifestyle my parents had flaunted had been built on stolen foundation. "Your parents mortgaged the family vacation house," David continued. "The one that's been in our family for 60 years. They used it as collateral for business loans that they're now defaulting on. We might lose it." That vacation house was more than property, it was legacy, tradition, the place where 3 generations of family memories had been made. My parents hadn't just stolen from me, they'd gambled with the entire family's heritage and lost. The phone calls from my parents became increasingly desperate. When I finally changed my number again, they started showing up at my apartment building. The doorman learned to recognize them and turn them away, but not before other residents began asking questions about the frantic couple who kept demanding to see me. My mother tried enlisting my old friends as intermediaries. "Please," she begged my college roommate, "just ask Sophia to call me. We can work this out. Family is family." But my friends had witnessed my parents' treatment of me over the years. They'd seen the subtle cruelty, the constant criticism, the way my parents had always made me feel like I wasn't quite good enough. Now that the tables had turned, their sympathy was in short supply. The most satisfying part wasn't even their financial destruction, it was watching them discover what I had learned years ago, that when you treat people badly, they remember. Every person my parents had snubbed, every relationship they'd neglected, every bridge they'd burned in pursuit of status and success came back to haunt them when they needed help most. The country club revoked their membership for unpaid dues. The charity organizations asked them to step down from leadership positions. The social invitations stopped coming. The business networks expelled them. One by one, every connection they'd built over decades began severing itself from their toxic influence. My father, who had once commanded rooms full of successful people, found himself eating lunch alone. My mother, who had orchestrated elaborate social events, spent her days in an empty house, waiting for phone calls that never came. They'd become exactly what they'd always feared most, irrelevant. But even as I watched their world crumble around them, I knew this was only the middle of the story. The real climax was still coming. Because while they'd lost their money, their status, and their friends, they hadn't yet faced the one thing that would complete their destruction, the legal consequences of their theft. That reckoning was scheduled for next week, in a courtroom where their crimes would be laid bare in front of a judge who wouldn't care about their excuses or their explanations. Where the full weight of the law would come down on them like the hammer of justice they'd spent 3 years dodging. They thought losing their lifestyle was the worst thing that could happen to them. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The courthouse steps were gray concrete beneath a gray sky, fitting weather for what was about to happen inside. I arrived early, dressed in the same black suit I'd worn to my grandmother's funeral. Somehow, it seemed appropriate for another kind of ending. Whitfield met me outside, his expression serious but satisfied. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, adjusting his briefcase. "I've been ready for this my entire life," I replied, and I meant it. Every cruel word, every dismissive look, every time my parents had made me feel small had been leading to this moment. Inside, the courtroom was sterile and imposing, all wood paneling and formal procedures. My parents sat at the defendant's table with their own lawyer, a desperate-looking man who'd probably taken their case, because no one else would. They looked smaller somehow, diminished by the formal setting and the weight of their impending judgment. My mother wore a conservative blue dress, probably borrowed since most of her wardrobe had been sold to pay legal fees. My father's suit was wrinkled, his usual commanding presence replaced by the hunched posture of a man who knew he was beaten. Judge Harrison was a stern woman in her 60s who'd built her reputation on having zero tolerance for financial fraud. She'd reviewed all the documents, heard the preliminary arguments, and now she was ready to render judgment on 3 years of theft disguised as family management. "This case," she began, her voice carrying easily through the courtroom, "involves the systematic misappropriation of inheritance funds by the defendants, Daniel and Margaret Chen, against their daughter, the plaintiff, Sophia Chen." Hearing it stated so formally, so officially, was like watching my entire childhood recontextualized. This wasn't family drama, this was criminal behavior. My parents weren't just bad people, they were actual criminals who'd hidden behind familial relationships to steal from me. "The evidence clearly shows," Judge Harrison continued, "that the defendants used their daughter's inheritance to fund their personal lifestyle for a period of 3 years, despite having no legal authority to do so. They forged documents, misrepresented their authority, and engaged in fraudulent activities to maintain access to funds that did not belong to them." My father started to stand, probably to offer some explanation or excuse, but his lawyer pulled him back down. There was nothing left to say. The evidence was overwhelming, documented, undeniable. Furthermore, the judge said, her voice growing colder, the defendant's treatment of their daughter when she began asking questions about the estate demonstrates a pattern of emotional abuse designed to maintain their fraudulent access to her inheritance. Emotional abuse. The words hit me like a revelation. It wasn't just theft, it was systematic psychological manipulation designed to keep me from discovering their crimes. Every time they'd made me feel guilty for asking about money, every time they'd criticized my financial decisions, every time they'd made me feel like I wasn't capable of handling my own affairs, it had all been part of their criminal conspiracy. The financial restitution was enormous. $200,000 in back rent, plus interest. $50,000 in fraudulent use of funds. $30,000 in legal fees. Damages for emotional distress. The total was more than my parents could pay in 3 lifetimes, even if they managed to rebuild their careers from scratch. But the judge wasn't finished. In cases involving family financial fraud, the court must consider not only the monetary damages, but also the breach of trust that makes such crimes possible. She looked directly at my parents, her expression stern and unforgiving. When parents steal from their own children, they don't just commit a crime, they destroy the fundamental bonds that hold families together. My mother started crying then, quiet tears that she tried to hide behind her hands. But these weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of self-pity, the same kind of emotional manipulation she'd been using on me my entire life. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done to me, she was sorry that she'd been caught. The defendants will serve 18 months in minimum security prison, followed by 3 years of probation during which all financial activities will be monitored by the court. Judge Harrison's gavel came down like thunder. In addition, they are permanently barred from acting as financial representatives for any family member, and a restraining order will be issued preventing any contact with the plaintiff without court supervision. 18 months in prison. 3 years of probation. Permanent financial monitoring. A restraining order that would finally give me legal protection from their manipulation and abuse. Justice wasn't just blind, apparently. She had perfect vision when it came to family fraud. As the court officers approached to begin the process of taking my parents into custody, my father finally broke his silence. "Sophia," he called out, his voice cracking with desperation, "we're still your parents. We still love you. This is still your family." I stood up slowly, every eye in the courtroom on me. This was my moment, my chance to respond to the man who had spent 28 years making me feel worthless. The man who had called me a disgrace, stolen my inheritance, and manipulated me into doubting my own worth. "No," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "You were my parents. But parents don't steal from their children. Parents don't humiliate their children in public. Parents don't spend 3 years lying and manipulating and gaslighting their own daughter to cover up their crimes." I walked closer to the defendant's table, close enough to see the desperation in their eyes, the dawning realization that this was really happening, that their years of financial manipulation were finally over. "You called me a disgrace to this family," I continued, my voice steady and strong. "But you're wrong. I'm not a disgrace, I'm a stranger. I'm the stranger you created when you chose money over love, control over trust, cruelty over compassion." I paused, savoring the moment. "And now, finally, I'm a stranger by choice." The court officers moved in then, reading my parents their rights, explaining the process of surrendering themselves to begin their sentences. My father tried to maintain his dignity, standing straight and walking out under his own power. My mother collapsed, sobbing, having to be supported by the officers as they led her away. I watched them disappear through the courthouse doors, probably for the last time. The people who had given me life, raised me, shaped me, and then betrayed me so completely that they destroyed any possibility of redemption. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete freedom. Not just financial freedom, though my grandmother's inheritance was finally, legally, indisputably mine. Not just emotional freedom, though the restraining order meant I'd never have to endure their manipulation again. I felt the freedom that comes from having your truth validated by the highest authority. A judge had listened to the evidence and confirmed what I'd always suspected but never dared to say: that my parents' treatment of me was not only wrong, it was criminal. The woman who walked down those courthouse steps was not the same person who had fled that engagement party 6 months earlier. That woman had been broken, humiliated, convinced she was the problem. This woman knew exactly who the real criminals were, and she'd just watched justice served cold and perfect. The morning light streams through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new apartment, illuminating everything my grandmother's legacy has made possible. The space is beautiful: hardwood floors, exposed brick, views of the city that stretch to the horizon, but more than that, it's mine. Truly, completely, legally mine in a way nothing ever was when my parents controlled my life. 6 months have passed since the courthouse, 6 months since I watched my former parents led away in handcuffs to begin serving the consequences of their cruelty. The restraining order means I haven't seen them, haven't heard from them, haven't had to endure a single moment of their manipulation or abuse. The silence that began as my weapon has become my sanctuary. I keep a framed photo of my grandmother on my desk now, the only picture I have where she's smiling. She's standing in front of one of her properties, looking proud and determined, like she knew exactly what legacy she was building for me. I wish I could tell her how her quiet strength saved me, how her hidden wealth became the foundation not just of my financial independence, but of my emotional freedom. The business I started with the inheritance money is thriving. Property management, helping other people understand and protect their assets, making sure no one else gets trapped in the kind of financial manipulation that controlled my life for so long. It turns out I have a talent for seeing through people's lies about money, probably because I lived with master manipulators for 28 years. My former fiancé tried to contact me 3 months ago, wanting to reconnect now that my financial situation had stabilized. I had my assistant send him a message: some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. People who abandon you in your darkest moments don't deserve to share your brightest ones. The social circles that froze me out after the engagement party have tried to welcome me back now that my inheritance is public knowledge. Suddenly, everyone wants to be friends with the woman who inherited millions and destroyed her parents' reputation in the process. But I've learned that respect built on fear and money is worthless compared to the respect you build for yourself. I've made new friends, real ones, people who knew me when I had nothing and liked me anyway. People who see strength in survival rather than weakness in victimhood. People who understand that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is cut toxic people out of your life completely, even when those people share your DNA. The family has reorganized itself around my parents' absence. Cousin David inherited their house when they defaulted on the mortgage, and he's turned it into something warm and welcoming instead of the cold monument to status it used to be. The family vacation house was saved when I anonymously paid off the loans my parents had secured against it. Some legacies are worth preserving, even when the people who endangered them aren't. My mother's sister Jennifer sent me a card on my birthday. The first acknowledgement from the extended family that I exist as something other than a disappointment. Inside, she'd written, "Your grandmother would be proud of the woman you've become." It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. After years of being the family black sheep, I'd become someone worth acknowledging. The legal battles are over, but the emotional victory continues every day. I wake up in a space that reflects my choices, my values, my vision of what life should be. I make decisions based on my own judgment rather than fear of someone else's disapproval. I build relationships based on mutual respect rather than manipulation and control. Sometimes people ask me if I miss them, if I ever think about reaching out, if I feel guilty about what happened to them. The answer is always the same: you can't miss people who never really existed. The parents I thought I had were illusions, carefully constructed facades designed to hide their greed and selfishness. The people who went to prison were the real versions, the ones who saw their own daughter as nothing more than a source of money to steal and control. There's a difference between justice and revenge, though they can look similar from the outside. Revenge is about making someone suffer because they made you suffer. Justice is about ensuring that actions have consequences, that crime is punished, that victims are made whole. What happened to my parents wasn't revenge, it was the natural result of their own choices finally catching up with them. I drive past their old house sometimes, the one that belonged to Cousin David now. He's painted it a warmer color, planted flowers in the front yard, made it look like a place where love lives instead of calculation. The neighborhood kids play on the lawn where I used to be afraid to make noise. It's become the kind of home it always should have been. The restraining order expires in 2.5 years, but I won't be renewing it. Not because I forgive them or want them back in my life, but because I no longer need legal protection from people who have no power over me. By the time they're released from prison, I'll be so far beyond their reach that their approval or disapproval will be as irrelevant as the weather on Mars. This morning, I stand at my window and look out at a city full of possibilities, thinking about the woman who fled that engagement party in shame and humiliation. She was so afraid of being alone, so convinced that being rejected by her family meant being rejected by the world. She couldn't imagine that sometimes being a stranger is exactly what you need to be. They called me a stranger that night, trying to make me feel worthless and alone. But strangers have something that family members often don't: the freedom to define themselves. Strangers can choose their own path, build their own relationships, create their own definition of success and happiness. I'm still a stranger to my former parents, and I always will be. But I'm not the broken, desperate stranger they tried to create through their cruelty. I'm the stranger I chose to become: strong, independent, successful, surrounded by people who actually care about me rather than what I can do for them. The phone rings, interrupting my reflection. It's Whitfield, calling with news about a new case, another family financial fraud situation where someone needs an advocate who understands how these things work from the inside. Another family stealing from their own children? I ask. Afraid so. Same pattern. Emotional manipulation combined with financial control. They need someone who understands how to fight back. I smile, looking out at the city that's become my kingdom, the life that's become my masterpiece. Tell them I'll take the case. Nobody should have to live through what I lived through. Because that's the final irony of my parents' cruelty. In trying to destroy me, they created exactly the person I needed to become. They thought calling me a disgrace would break me, but instead, it freed me. They thought humiliating me publicly would control me, but instead, it taught me that their opinion was worthless. They thought stealing from me would keep me dependent, but instead, it gave me the motivation to become completely independent. Now I use the strength they tried to destroy to help other people escape the traps they tried to keep me in. Every victim I help, every family fraud I expose, every financial abuser I bring to justice is another way my grandmother's legacy lives on. Her quiet strength didn't just save me, it's saving others. The stranger they created has become someone they never imagined she could be. Someone who doesn't need their approval, doesn't fear their disapproval, doesn't require their love to know she's valuable. Someone who learned that sometimes, the best thing terrible parents can do for their children is show them exactly what kind of person they never want to become. I close the blinds and turn toward the day ahead, meetings with clients who need advocacy, decisions about properties that need managing, choices about how to use wealth as a tool for justice rather than control. A life that belongs completely and entirely to me. They wanted to make me a stranger to their family. Mission accomplished. I just didn't turn out to be the kind of stranger they had in mind. Tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and self-respect? Have you ever discovered that the people who were supposed to protect you are actually the ones hurting you? Share your story, because every person who breaks free from family toxicity makes it easier for the next person to escape. And if this story resonated with you, if you understand what it means to be called a stranger by people who never really knew you anyway, hit that subscribe button. Because sometimes, being a stranger is the greatest gift you can give yourself. The woman who fled that engagement party in tears thought her life was over. She was wrong. Her real life was just beginning.